and psychologically accepted regions were, those chiefs, they lost their positions to these chiefs. So the chiefs that were there were now puppets of the French. The lack of adequate French personnel to supervise the assimilation process. Remember, assimilation was with one, culture. Number two, way of doing things. Number three, even education. So the French personnel that was needed was a lot. When you want to turn the culture, that the French assimilation. Why? Because its application was going to lead to the loss of labor. Now, the French who had settled in Western Africa, they knew that the assimilated Africans, they were not going to be allowed to work in the French farms. Why? Because they were treated as equal citizens of France. So this meant that these Africans, the French, by the way, back at home, or those who stayed in Senegal and West Africa, they knew that automatically assimilation policy was going to make them lose African labor. Then again, the system challenged the political status quo of France, meaning French was staring at a possibility where maybe an African could even become their president. Why? Because the French who had assimilated, the Senegalese who had been assimilated, they had even voting rights. So it meant that it was challenging the status quo of the French. Again, it disregarded the Islamic aspect of African culture that made the policy to fail. One thing that the French were so Christian, especially Catholicism. So when they promoted this in Senegal, this challenged the existing Islamic culture that was predominant with the Africans. Islamic culture had allowed them even marrying up to 4 wives. It allowed them Sharia laws. And by accepting to be assimilated, it meant that you had to give up Islam and embrace Christianity. Then that became an uphill task for the Africans. Then the high standards expectation of the French for the assimilated Africans made it to be unworkable. Again, by being as French citizens, there were standards that were so unacceptable for Africans. For instance, the standard of monogamy and every other thing. It was very unworkable for Africans. Then fear that the assimilated Africans could rival the French economy. So the assimilated Africans, they were allowed to own farms also. They were allowed to conduct trade. They were allowed to move in the various French provinces of West Africa. And this meant that these French people were economically empowering the assimilated Africans. And this was just unworkable for the French because they were not going to allow the people that they colonized to rival them economically. Then the second last, the French themselves opposed it since they did not want to destroy the French colonial empire. Now, the colonial empire was meant to enable French to extract mineral riches, raw materials, and everything. Now, after assimilating the people, it meant that the French were going to make another economy again in Africa instead of deriving from Africa. This sounded an alarm to the French, who themselves, they had to oppose it, the French citizens. Why? It was destroying the French empire. Then the last thing is that the rise of African nationalism undermined the policy of assimilation. Now, African nationalism wanted nothing to do with the French. They wanted a free Africans who could govern themselves. That is where Leopold Senghor, the first president of Senegal, the poet, in fact, who assumed presidency, they came in. They wanted nothing to do with French autonomy, but they wanted to become leaders. Now, this was against the French assimilation policy. Now, as I conclude, I want you to compare the British system of administration, both direct and indirect, and the French system of assimilation. Even though assimilation policy failed, the things that they achieved. Even though direct and indirect policies of administration that the British applied succeeded in Africa, they had its lasting impact. Number one, the civilization mission of the French, it made Africans to become very, very educated. Again, they emerged elites or social class among the assimilated Africans. Again, the structures that were introduced during this policy of assimilation were copied by the independent government. They were inherited, which were very, very good. Then the elite class spearheaded the African nationalism in Senegal, and it led to their independence. Again, the Africans they were even allowed to take part in the affairs of the French political system. Then again, the traditional rulers, they lost the authority. But these effects cannot be compared to what the atrocities that the British left us with. They left us with ethnicity. Yes, they left us with a lot of class. So in our next, we've ended this unit. So next I'll go to paper 1, which will tackle social economic developments during colonial period in Kenya. That is paper 1. Thank you and have a nice time, ladies and gentlemen.